Thank you to Aegean College for inviting me, and Vivi and the team for making it possible. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah. Let me start with 3 Greek stories, okay? Given that I'm in Greece. One is that there was an article in the New York Times, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, about a Greek man who comes to the United States and becomes a steelworker in Chicago, I think. He left Greece after the Civil War. He was a left-winger, and he had to leave Greece after the Civil War during the dictatorship. He comes to the United States, becomes a steelworker, and develops cancer of the lung. And they tell him that if he gets treatment, he's got 6 months to live. And if he doesn't get treatment, he's got 3 months to live. So now he's got a dilemma. You know, he says, well, where should I die? If I die here in the United States, my funeral costs will eat up all my savings, and there'll be nothing left for my children. So he decides to come back to Greece to die. And he comes to his island where he's originally from, Ikaria, that you've probably heard about. And on his deathbed, of course, all his neighbors and relatives and nephews and uncles, everybody comes to visit him, and finally gets tired of lying in the deathbed, and he says, why am I lying in the bed here? Why don't I sit on the porch? So he goes in and sits on the porch overlooking the garden, and people come visit him, and he says, what am I sitting here in the porch for? Why don't I just go in the garden and do a little bit of gardening? So he starts gardening. Make a long story short, his cancer completely goes away. And 10, 15 years after he's supposed to have died, he comes back to the United States, and he says, I looked for the doctors to ask them what the hell happened to me, but they had all died. Now, I know quite a few such stories of people who've been given diagnoses, and for some strange reason, they don't die. And in Western medicine, we call these spontaneous remissions. But we never ask ourselves what exactly happened here. Now, what happened here, if you actually look at it, is number one, he didn't live under so much stress anymore when he was back home. People everywhere on that island walked rather than drove cars. When somebody said they come for lunch, they may show up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They had no concept of hurrying and time. Neighbors were all connected to each other. That emotional support. Also, of course, what they didn't eat, which is the junk food in the United States, and what they did eat was the healthy Mediterranean diet. And all these factors contributed to his cancer going away. Now, this has been studied in other patients as well, quite extensively. And in the book, The Myth of Normal, I do talk about such cases. But what do such cases shows? It shows that the mind and the body cannot be separated. That what happens to people emotionally and socially has a huge impact on their physiology. That's the first Greek story that I'll tell you. The second Greek story that I'll tell you is that, as you all remember, I'm sure very, very well, is that in 2013, Greece was in great economic crisis, and people were under a lot of stress. So they did a study comparing Greek students here in Athens with comparable age students in London in the United Kingdom. And the Greek students reported higher levels of stress, they had lower hope for the future, and they had many more widespread symptoms of depression and anxiety, and physiologically, they had lower cortisol levels. Now, cortisol, as you know, is the stress hormone, and usually when we're stressed, the cortisol levels go up, and chronically high cortisol levels are, for reasons maybe I'll come to later, are significant contributors to physical illness. But lower cortisol levels are also very ominous because what they mean is that the body's stress response mechanism has been exhausted. And so the body can't mount the same kind of defense against stress. And so the researchers concluded that one suspects that the social crisis in Greece is beginning to have biological effects on the residents of that country, with, potential implications for illness later on in life, which brings me to my second point. So first of all, the mind and the body, the inseparability of the mind and the body, number one. And number two, the inseparability of the body and the mind from the social environment and the economic and the political environment. And there was a great German physician called Rudolf Virchow who functioned, he's the father of modern pathology actually. His name is still revered in medical education. And it's very interesting how many pioneers of medicine made these very astute and essential observations about the true nature of health. And their physical achievements, their biological achievements are still revered and remembered and valued, but what they said about the broader social and the emotional implications of those same findings are completely ignored in modern medicine. So Virchow, who's considered the father of modern pathology, he said that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine on a larger scale, implying that social circumstances, political decisions, economic factors have everything to do with human health. That's my second Greek story. My third Greek story comes from 2,400 years ago, when Socrates quoted a doctor from Thrace, up in the north, who criticized his Greek colleagues. And he said that the problem, this is the great error of the doctors of our day, is that they separate the mind from the body. This is the great error of the mind of the doctors of today, he said 2,400 years ago. Well, unfortunately, this is still the great error of the doctors of today. And everything I'm telling you is science-based. And so what is weird here, if you don't want to call it weird, is that these insights about the unity of social factors, emotional factors, and our physiology, and how that affects our physical and mental health, has been amply demonstrated scientifically. See, Socrates, or the doctor that he was quoting, he had no science to back him up. He just had his intuition. In 1870, Jean-Martin Charcot, who was the French neurologist who first described multiple sclerosis, he said that this disease is caused by a long-standing vexation or stress and grief. Charcot had no scientific evidence to support that because they didn't have the science yet. In the 150 years since he made that observation, we have plenty of scientific evidence linking childhood trauma, adult stress, and multiple sclerosis. In 1890, a great Canadian physician, considered to be one of the great medical teachers of all times, Sir William Mosler, he was active at Johns Hopkins in the States, at Oxford in England, and of course in Canada. And he was knighted by Queen Victoria. Sir William Mosler said that rheumatoid arthritis is a stress-driven disease. He had no scientific evidence. He had his observation. In the 150 years since he, or 130 years since he made that observation, we have plenty of research evidence showing the physiological and emotional links between childhood trauma and stress and the onset of rheumatoid arthritis. Lots of scientific evidence. And the average rheumatologist hasn't got a clue about it. In 1870, James Paget, who was a breast surgeon in the UK, in England, he pointed out the links between a woman's emotional states and breast cancer. Since then, we have plenty of evidence. He didn't have any. He just had his observation. But let me ask you this question now. I do this with all my audiences. So if in the last 5 years, if you've been to a oncologist, rheumatologist, neurologist, dermatologist, immunologist, cardiologist, gastroenterologist, any kind of an ologist, just raise your hand, okay? All right, raise your hand. Good, all right, thank you. Now put your hand up if they ask you about childhood trauma. Do I see any hands? One hand, two, great, that's wonderful. Good doctors, keep them. Okay, did they ask you about how you feel about yourself as a human being? Put your hand up. One person, two maybe, okay? I could go through all these questions, and yet those issues of how you feel about yourself as a human being, did they ask you about how you feel about your work? Again, one person, two maybe, all right. Yet those issues about how you feel about yourself as a human being, what trauma you may have experienced in childhood, what your relationships like with your friends and your spouse and your family, to work, they had everything to do while you were there in that office. And the average physician just doesn't know or think about that. There was a study 4 years ago now, from Harvard University that showed that women with severe post-traumatic stress disorder have double the risk of ovarian cancer. Double the risk. The average gynecologist hasn't got a clue. And the lower the symptoms of PTSD, the less the risk of ovarian cancer. And even that study wasn't new. We've already had previous studies linking stress to ovarian cancer. So there's a huge gap between on the one hand, what individual insightful physicians have noted for a long time, on the one hand, and science and scientific evidence on the other, on the same hand actually, and on the other hand, how medicine is practiced. And this is true whether it comes to physical medicine, whether it comes to psychiatry, and unfortunately, it's often true when it comes to psychology as well. So we make these separations. So we create individual diagnoses and individual pathologies thinking that they're separate somehow. And so we talk about diagnoses. So you might have a diagnosis. Somebody has ADHD, or somebody has depression, or somebody has multiple personality disorder or dissociated identity disorder, or somebody else has anxiety disorder. And we think that, look at that language, just think about it. Language is very important. If you look at the language, when I say that I have this book, any book, it's an object. Well, this book I happen to write, but in general, a book is an object. It's no part of me. It's an object that I have. It's got characteristics of its own that are independent of me. Or I have a cell phone. This cell phone, the characteristics of the cell phone are completely independent of me. I can put it down, give it away, throw it away, lose it, use it, whatever I want to do with it, but it's no part of me. It's independent. So if I say I have a cell phone, I'm talking about a separate entity that I, another entity, possesses. And when we say that somebody has ADHD, or somebody has depression, or somebody has multiple sclerosis, or somebody has rheumatoid arthritis, or somebody has bipolar disorder, we're making the same assumption. We're saying that there's this thing called multiple sclerosis, there's this thing called depression, there's this thing called bipolar disorder, there's this thing called multiple sclerosis, and that's separate from the individual. It's got its own characteristics, its own life, it's going to do what it's going to do. And we can maybe interfere with it, mitigate it, lessen the symptoms of it. Occasionally we can cure it, but we do see it as something in its own right, separate from me, the individual in whom it's happening. Well, that's one way to look at it. But there's a completely different way of looking at it, which is that depression or anxiety or multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, they're not things in themselves. They're processes. They're processes that manifest a person's life. A person's life beginning with the multi-generational family history. A person's life beginning with their experience in the womb. A person's experience based on what kind of birth they had. A person's experience based on how the mother's mood was when she was looking after the baby, what the relationship between the parents was when the child was growing up, what kind of culture did they live in, which ethnic group do they belong to in that particular culture, what is the situation of that ethnic group in relationship to the larger culture, what is the class economically that they were born into. It's all a process. And I'm suggesting that this view of looking at mental health conditions, which is what mostly as psychology practitioners you're going to be concerned with, or physical health conditions, which is the physician I was mostly concerned with, we're looking at not individual entities and things in themselves, but we're actually looking at processes. Now, in 1939, there was a very famous physician at Harvard University. His name was Soma Weiss, and Weiss was Hungarian like myself, and from Transylvania in this case. And he taught at Harvard, and he was one of the most respected teachers at Harvard, so respected that to this day, annually, they have a research day in his honor. And in 1939, Soma Weiss, who was a pharmacologist and a physiologist, made the following statement in a lecture to a medical school class. He said that social and psychic factors play a role in every disease, but in many conditions, they represent dominant influences. And then he said, mental factors represent as active a force in the treatment of patients as chemical and physical agents. In 1940, this lecture that he gave to this medical school class was reprinted in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. Jump ahead to 4 years ago when I was writing this book, and I was speaking to a leading psychiatrist at Harvard. His name is Dr. Jeff Rediger. And Jeff has written a book called Cured, The Miraculous Science of Spontaneous Remission. Because what Jeff did is he looked at all these people like that man from Icaria, whose disease goes away for reasons we can't understand. And he finds out that there's nothing spontaneous about it, that in every case, there are certain factors that promoted the healing. It wasn't just accidental and random. And he actually documented all these cases. Other researchers have done that same thing. But anyway, I'm talking to Jeff Rediger, because I read his book and I was interviewing him for my book. And he said to me, this is 2019, which is exactly what, 80 years after Soma Weiss made these observations, reprinted in the Journal of the Medical Association. And Jeff said to me, to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard today is to jeopardize your career. He says it's getting better, but it's still really, really difficult. And a book I wrote, which has been published in Greece, When the Body Says No, a rheumatologist at University of California, Los Angeles, read the book, in which I point out the relationship between emotional factors and rheumatic diseases. And she started practicing it. You know, it made sense to her. She started practicing it. So I met her at this conference, and somewhere in San Francisco. And she said, boy, ever since I read that book and ever since I'm practicing it, I'm getting so much better results. And people are getting off their medications because they're dealing with their emotional stuff. So I said, can I interview you for my new book? And she said, yeah, you can interview me, but don't use my name, because my colleagues would look badly upon me. They would think I was crazy. So this is huge gap. Now, there was, the other ironic thing about all this is that from the point of view of Eastern medicine, so in Western medicine, already here in Greece, all those years ago, this was a problem. In Eastern healing practices and Eastern spiritual practices, it was never a question of separating any of this stuff. So the Buddha, he talked about interdependent co-arising, that everything arises in relationship to everything else. So he said, contemplate the nature of interdependent co-arising during every moment, he said. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on the conditions, near and distant, that contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Know that the world is woven of interconnected threads. This is because that is. That is not because this is not. And of course, that leaf, when you think about it, is not on the leaf is not an independent, separate object with its own nature. It contains the sun, doesn't it? You know, photosynthesis. It contains the sky, the rain that falls, that goes into the leaf, the earth, maybe human or animal activity. Like everything contains everything else. So the Buddha said all those years ago that without the one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. That's 2,500 years ago. Indigenous healing traditions have always, they didn't have the science that we have. And I really want you to hear that in no way am I minimizing the incredible achievements of Western science or Western medicine. I mean, it's really stupendous what Western medicine has been able to achieve in so many areas. But when it comes to understanding chronic conditions of mind and body, we're very poor. And very poor because we're not ignoring the unity of everything. So when I'm talking about these insights and indigenous traditions, I'm not saying that they were better. I'm saying that they had the wisdom that we've lost. And ideally, we would combine the science of Western psychology, actually, and Western physiology, and Western medicine, with these age-old indigenous or Eastern traditions. So a friend of mine who is a psychiatrist and a physician in the United States, and he's partly of indigenous background. His name is Dr. Louis Mel Madrona, and he's part of Lakota. Lakota is one of the indigenous tribes in the United States. And he said that in the Lakota tradition, when somebody gets ill, the community basically says to him or her, thank you. You're the one who's downloading and manifesting the illness that's in the whole community. You're the one that's showing it up, and therefore your healing is our healing. So healing is a communal process, not just an isolated physiological process in the hands of experts, but it's a process in which the client participates, as does the community. It's a completely different way of looking at healing. Now, modern science shows you the same thing. So there's a great psychiatrist that I understand is coming to Athens in September, a friend of mine, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose work many of you will know, his very well-known book, The Body Keeps the Score. He sold more books than I have, you know. so far. Anyway, his book, The Body Keeps the Score, how many of you have read it? Quite some of you have. It's a wonderful book. It's not an easy read, but it's been 250 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list, which itself is really interesting, how a fairly dense book on trauma becomes such a bestseller. And anyway, Bessel says that all culture teaches us to focus on our personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Now, there's something very interesting. In an ant colony, I don't know if you realize this, but in an ant colony, all the ants have exactly the same genes. So whether they're workers or whether they're the queen, they have the same genetic makeup. Their DNA, you couldn't tell from their DNA who's who. And yet the queen looks totally different. She's larger, she's capable of ovulating, producing eggs, and she lives longer. Now, if you take the queen out of an ant colony, there's going to be a struggle among some of the worker ants. They start chopping at each other and biting each other and chopping their legs and heads off until some of them gain dominance and they become the queen and they become larger. They start producing eggs and they live longer. And the genes have not changed at all. But how the genes function has changed. And that's called epigenetics, which simply means that the DNA by itself does not determine. It's the DNA in interaction with the environment. And not only the DNA interaction with the environment, but the DNA in interaction with the needs of the larger society and culture that you're in. So then if you look at some statistics that are very painful, but they all of a sudden start making sense. So in Canada, if you look at Indigenous women, and the Indigenous people in Canada never used to have rheumatic diseases. They didn't have autoimmune diseases at all, as far as we can tell, until colonialism. And now, an Indigenous woman has a risk of rheumatoid arthritis 6 times that of the average person in Canada, 6 times. And it's got nothing to do with genetics. It's got to do with the stress of being Indigenous, and the terrible history of what happened to Indigenous people in our country. I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but I'll tell you one story of an Indigenous woman that I met. And it's a very typical story, by the way. For 100 years or more, Indigenous children in Canada were taken away from their parents by force and put into these residential schools, which were run by the church. Different churches, mostly the Catholic Church, but also Protestant churches, where these children were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. And there's a woman, and this went on until the 1990s, 1980s in Canada, very recent. So I met a woman in her 60s who, when she was 4 years old, and I had just arrived in Canada in 1957, and she was 4 years old, she was taken to the residential school, and by the way, if the parents tried to see their kids, the police came to get them. And this 4-year-old made the mistake of speaking her own native tribal language. And what they did, the teacher, to punish her and teach her that this is not something you can do in this school, stuck a pin in her tongue. And for a whole hour, that kid sit there with a pin in her tongue, couldn't put her tongue back in her mouth because she would cut her lips. And this is a typical story. And that's before the sexual, emotional, and physical abuse began shortly thereafter. And so she becomes this drug addict. And now her children and grandchildren have become drug addicts. And then we talk about addiction as this genetic brain disorder. Well, I'll say something more about that later. But what I'm saying here is that this statistic about Indigenous women and rheumatoid arthritis is totally not surprising because A, she's Indigenous, and B, she is a woman. And if you look at autoimmune diseases, where the body, the immune system attacks the body, it's like if the Greek army invaded Greece with hostile intention. The immune system turns against the body. That's an autoimmune disease. Multiple sclerosis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, probably chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, colitis, Crohn's disease, inflammations of the bowel, inflammations of the skin, fibrosis of the lungs. These are all autoimmune diseases, impacts of the immune system turning against the body. These happen mostly to women. About 80% of autoimmune disease happens to women. And everybody says, oh, what a big mystery. There's nothing mysterious about it. If you realize the sources of these illnesses as not being individual pathologies in an isolated organ, but they're actually manifestations of a process that happens in an individual in the context of a culture. So I may say something more about that a little bit later. But for now, let me talk about my own diagnoses for a minute, just to illustrate for you the nature of diagnoses. So I've been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that diagnosis happened when I was in my 50s. And it's not like anybody diagnosed me. It's that I was working in a hospital, and a social worker that I was working with said, can we have coffee? And I said, sure. And she told me that she's just been diagnosed with ADHD, adult, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And as soon as she told me about herself, I realized why she wanted to have coffee with me, because I recognized myself, the poor attention skills, tuning out a lot, absent-mindedness, losing things, poor impulse control, difficulty sitting still, unless I was very, very motivated. I just recognized myself. And within a few weeks, months I should say, 2 of my children were diagnosed, which proves, or seems to prove, the medical mantra that ADHD is a genetic brain disorder. It's an inherited disease of the brain, genetically determined. In fact, they say that ADHD is the most inheritable mental disease there is. Well, I'm telling you something. It's neither a disease, nor is it inheritable genetically. And intuitively, I didn't have the science. Honest to God, I didn't, because nobody told me about the science. But I intuited something, which is that tuning out, the absent-mindedness, is not a disease. What is it? If I were to threaten you right now and put a lot of stress on you, you would have 3 healthy options. One is to ask for help. Lots of people in the audience, this guy's bugging me, he's bothering me, please help me. That's a healthy option. Which, by the way, what children do automatically. I mean, a 1-day-old baby, as soon as they have any kind of distress, they cry for help. So that's the first option. The second option, in this audience here, if I were to put stress on you, threaten you, be inappropriate with you, just to get up and leave. Flight. Or you could stand up to me and say, don't talk to me like that, don't do that to me, stop it. Fight. So those are the healthy options. But what would you do if there was no help available, and if you didn't have the option of leaving or fighting back? Then what would you do? Well, you wouldn't do anything. What your brain would do is to kind of go into a freeze mode and tune out, to diminish the stress, or to not be aware of it. And I knew something about, well, I knew my own infancy. If you read my books, you know this, so that I was a Jewish infant born in 1944 in Hungary, just 2 months before the Germans occupied Hungary, and I know that Greece has had its own history with the German occupation in the Second World War, and particularly what happened to the Jewish population of Thessaloniki. And so I was 2 months old when the Germans marched into Budapest and occupied the country. And the day after, you may have heard the story before, the day after the Germans troops occupied Hungary, my mother phoned the pediatrician and said, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the doctor said, of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now what is that all about? What did I know about Hitler or Nazis or genocide? Nothing. What did I know? I knew I was picking up the stress of my mother. Because as we know now, infants absorb the stresses of their parents. What could I do with that stress? Ask for help? From whom? From my stressed mother, whose parents were killed in Auschwitz when I was 5 months of age, whose husband was away in forced labor. She didn't even know if he was dead or alive most of that year. And so the tuning out becomes a defense mechanism. But when is this happening? This is happening when my brain is developing. And here's what we know about brain development now. It's not just a physiological process. It's a physiological process that from the womb, beginning in the womb, is affected by the emotional environment. So we know that the emotional states of the mother during pregnancy are already affecting the physiology of the brain. There's a famous study that was done by Dr. Rachel Yehuda in New York after the terrorist bombings of the World Trade Center in New York in, was it 2001? 9/11, as the Americans call it. And she looked at mothers who'd been pregnant during that disaster and developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And a year later, their children still had abnormal cortisol, stress hormone levels, which means that their physiology and their mental states would be affected for a long time by what happened to their mothers while they were in the womb. And then, of course, what's the environment in the home? So here's how the brain develops. And I'm going to quote you from an article that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Association, and in 2012. And again, this is one of these articles that often get published. And they come from, this article comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is the world's most prestigious child development and research institution. If you want to know about child development, just go on their website and download all the papers on brain development and child development and how it's affected by the environment. And so this is what they said in this article. The architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Not some of the health learning, all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. You want to understand your clients? Understand what happened to them from before they were born. And this is where the whole concept of the genetic causation of mental health conditions or most physical health conditions is so off base. I mean, there are some very rare diseases that really are genetically determined. There is Huntington's chorea. If you have the gene, you have a 99% chance of getting the disease. Muscular dystrophy, some kinds, runs in my family. My mother died with it, my aunt died with it, previous generations. If you have the gene, you'll get the disease. But those are very rare, like 1 in 10,000. So when they talk about bipolar illness being genetic and ADHD being genetic, I'll tell you a simple scientific fact. Nobody has ever found a single gene that you can link to a single mental health disorder, meaning that if you have this gene, you're going to have this disease. Nobody's found a group of genes that if you have these genes, you can have this particular mental health condition. Nobody's ever found a group of genes that if you don't have them, you cannot have that mental health condition. The most they have found is a large group of genes. The more them you have, the more likely you are to have any number of mental health conditions, but nothing specific. So then you have to ask, well, what is actually being inherited here? Something is being inherited, but it's not the diseases. Because people with the same set of genes brought up in different environments will have very different outcomes. So the genes don't determine. You know what the genetic studies are largely based on twin studies. And what they do is they look at identical or fraternal twins. And if they're brought up in the same family, the assumption is that they have the same environment. And if they're brought up in different families, then they're brought up in a different environment. Now, ideally, you're doing this with identical twins because they have the same genes. So anything that's similar about them has to be genetic. Anything that's different about them, it's got to be the environment. So goes the theory. But it's nonsense. Because it's not true that identical twins grew up in different environments. They spent 9 months in the same uterus, dealing with the very same stresses of that mother. Not only that, one of them may have got a bit more nutrition than the other, as often is the case. So they didn't have the same experience. And not only that, they both experienced the trauma of separation from the birth mother. And I could go on. But there's all these reasons why those genetic twin studies don't prove anything at all. So that's the first paragraph on this brain developmental study. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. That's the first sentence. The second sentence. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain. In other words, the physiology of the brain, which neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, will be present, depends on what happens. It's not automatic. It's not genetic automatically. So the interaction of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. This is a study article from Harvard. They didn't make this up. Their article summarized 30 years of brain research by then, 20, 30 years of brain research. They simply showed the results of what the research had demonstrated. This article was published 11 years ago now. The average psychiatrist has never heard of this article, even though it was published in a major journal. The average physician hasn't heard about it, has no idea what it implies. And I would say, I don't know this, only you can tell me whether it's true here in your faculty, but many psychologists also are completely unaware of this kind of information. So that we are stuck then with looking at individual organs with their own separate pathology, not getting the whole picture, and not getting that. If you look at things from that point of view, so therefore, if you look at ADHD, it's just as an example, not as an inherited brain disorder, but as a response to the environment. It also means that the treatment becomes very different. Because if you look at it, this biological inherited brain disorder, what do you got? Now you can work on changing the child's behavior, and a lot of psychology is actually focused on changing behaviors. A lot of medicine is focused on changing behaviors, or you can change the child's brain physiology by way of medications. If you see this as a biological disorder of the brain. But what if you see it as an adaptation, which it was? What if you see it as an adaptation which occurred when the child was young and helpless in a stressed environment? And it does not take a world war, and it does not take genocide. It does not take dire circumstances to create stress for parents. Economic circumstances can do it. The trauma that parents are carrying from their own childhood can show up when we have children. The relationship between the parents. And my wife Ray, who's in the audience here, and who is, I always have to acknowledge that literally my work would not exist without her, because much of my learning was not from books, but from being criticized by my wife. No, that's not true, I'm joking. But it's that relationship, that where I learned so much of what I know about human beings. But when our children were small, we had a stressed relationship. And our children grew up in a very peaceful city in Vancouver, but in the home there was a lot of stress. And so those are sensitive kids. Download that stress. What do? They tune out. Now they're diagnosed with the so-called inheritable brain disorder. But if you recognize, or if you, let's look at something like depression. I mean, I could talk about physical disease here, and maybe I will. But since I'm talking to a group of psychologists or psychologists to be, I'm focusing on the mental health aspect of it. First of all, let's understand something. Diagnoses don't explain anything. They explain nothing. At some point they thought they did, but they don't actually. Let's take ADHD. Or let's take another one, depression. So-and-so has depression. Notice again the language. They have it. It's something that they have. And here are the characteristics of the condition, and this person who has it. Well, what if you looked upon depression not as an inherited disease or as a biological, as a disease of biological origin, but what if you recognized that the biology of the brain is itself a product of the environment? Because the brain is a social organ. It reflects your history. And as I said, it reflects your history even before you were born. Let me tell you an interesting epigenetic study. It's rather famous. Epigenetics meaning how the environment acts on the genes. You take mice and you have them smell a certain flower, a scent of a certain flower. And at the same time, you show them a predator, like a cat or a fox, outside their cage. So the mice gets very scared, naturally, at the presence of this predator, which now, according to Pavlovian conditioning, they associate with that scent, with that smell of that flower. And afterwards, whenever they smell that same flower scent, they show frightened behavior. Well, that's understandable. What is interesting is you can have their grandchildren smell the same flower, and they'll be scared as well, even though they've never seen a predator. And that's called epigenetics. So that to a certain degree, and we don't know what yet, we don't know yet to what degree, but epigenetics indicates that even in a physiological sense, trauma can be passed on from one generation to the next. So take something like depression. What if we didn't see it as a primary disease of the brain just to be fixed with medications? Incidentally, I'm not against medications. I'm a physician. I prescribe them. Not only have I prescribed them, I've taken them myself, and they've helped me. So I'm not here to argue against medications. I'm arguing for looking at medications and everything else in a certain context. And by the way, this whole idea that depression, the general theory of depression has dominated the medical thinking now for 4 decades, is that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin in the brain, serotonin being one of these neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that takes impulses from one nerve cell to the next. It's a very important neurotransmitter in the brain. And the theory has been that there's a lack of serotonin in the brain. Therefore, if you give you a medication that elevates serotonin levels like Prozac or citaprolam or paroxetine or serotonin or sertraline, Zoloft, by elevating the levels of serotonin, that's going to improve the depression. And of course, sometimes it does. But then we think this proves the theory. But you know how much actual scientific evidence there is that serotonin causes the lack of serotonin causes depression. This much evidence. Zero. Nothing. Nothing. And to argue that because giving somebody serotonin-enhancing medications improves their depression, therefore the cause of the depression has to be a lack of serotonin. It's like arguing that if you go to a party and you're kind of shy and withdrawn and you're sitting in a corner all by yourself and everybody else is having a good time, and then you have a shot of vodka and all of a sudden you feel sociable and friendly and you become humorous and voluble and you join the party and everybody loves you. Is it therefore true that your social shyness was caused by lack of vodka in your brain? You know, it's the same kind of argument. So then let's look at depression. Now if you look at the word itself, depression, what does it mean? Well, in English at least, it means to push something down. And what gets pushed down in depression are emotions, particularly healthy anger. There is such a thing as healthy anger. And in depression, the problem with pushing down one emotion is that there's no finesse, there's no accuracy of depression. And when you push something down, you push everything down. So the person with depression is kind of flat. And we talk about a flat affect, like a flat demeanor, a flat emotional state of being, because all the emotions are pushed down. Not only anger is pushed down, so is joy, so is curiosity, so is sociability, caring for others, allowing yourself to be cared for. All that stuff is pushed down. Well, why would somebody push down emotions? Well, one of the needs of the human child, and if I have time, I'll talk to you about them. One of the needs of human children is to be able to experience all their emotions. And not only to experience all their emotions, to have those emotions validated by mutually responsive adults. Remember that quote from the Harvard article? The emotional relationship, responsiveness between parent and child. That's the most important factor in brain development. Well, what if, as a 2-year-old, you have anger? And I've often given this example. If you're a parent, and if you never make your 2-year-old angry, you're probably not doing a good job. Because not that you deliberately make them angry, but the 2-year-old might feel like having a cookie before dinner, and you're not going to give them a cookie, not if you're doing a good job. No cookie. Well, what will the kid do? They'll have a tantrum. They'll have an anger display. That's okay, nothing wrong with that. Why wouldn't, you know, when my needs are frustrated, or what I think my needs are, I get angry too, you know. So the 2-year-old gets angry, but what if in that family, the parents have a really bad history with anger? They grew up with very angry parents, so they're scared and they hate anger. So they give the kid the message, good little kids don't get angry. And the message the child gets is, angry little kids don't get loved. The child's biggest need is for connection with the parents. So they have to maintain the connection. If this message is repeated chronically, over time and harshly enough, the child will push down their anger, push it down, get depressed. So that's one of the sources of depression. It's not the only one. But all the sources of depression do have to do with early development and early traumas. So it's an adaptation. It begins an adaptation, but it's in the nature of these adaptations that they play a certain function early in life, but later on, those same adaptations now create problems. And let me tell you, if you're going to be a therapist, and there's different types of psychologists and different types of psychological practice, but if you're going to be a therapist working with human beings, virtually everything, not virtually, everything anybody's going to bring into your office is going to be their adaptations that used to play a functional role when they were very small, but they don't anymore. So then the behaviors are only symptoms of early adaptations. And I'm saying this applies across the whole range of mental health conditions. I'd have to talk to you a lot longer to prove it to you, but I'm making that assertion. Which then brings me to talk about trauma now. Because trauma is a word that's on the one hand used too much, and on the other hand not used enough at all. So people use it a bit lightly, a bit loosely. They'll say, you know, I went on a picnic last Sunday and it rained and it was just traumatic. Well, you know, no it wasn't. It was disappointing, but it wasn't traumatic, you know. Or I had a big fight with my partner last night and it was traumatic. No, it wasn't. It was just stressful and painful. But not everything that's stressful and painful is traumatic. Everything that's traumatic is stressful and painful. But not everything stressful and painful is traumatic. So in that sense, the word is used a bit too loosely on the one hand. On the other hand, where it matters, it's not used at all. The average medical student in Canada, across the Western world, and I have no idea what happens in Greece here, but I would bet it's almost the same thing here. The average medical student does not get a single lecture on trauma in their 4 or 5 years of medical education. Even though, according to all the scientific evidence, trauma underlines all kinds of pathologies from mental to physical. All kinds of evidence, as I mentioned to you earlier, of the relationship between trauma, stress, and multiple sclerosis. Not only that, when people start dealing with their stresses, their multiple sclerosis can get better. I can give you all kinds of examples of that as well. When it comes to mental health conditions, then, let's say a child is diagnosed with, a lot of kids these days, at least in North America, but also increasingly in Europe, I don't know what the situation here in Greece is, a lot of kids are engaging in self-cutting behavior, more than ever used to. More and more kids, again, I don't know the Greek statistics, but more kids in North America, across Europe, are medicated for ADHD, for depression, for anxiety, for this, that, and the other. And the treatment is always focused on the individual, usually on the behavior, rather than asking, what is the behavior representing? So what if we understood, you know, that all those genes that I mentioned that are inherited, and the more they are, the more likely a kid is or a person is to have a certain mental health condition. What's being inherited, I think, are degrees of sensitivity. Not diseases, but sensitivities. And the more sensitive you are, the more likely you are to be hurt when things are not going well. So to give you an example, I pat myself on the shoulder here, no pain whatsoever. But if I wasn't wearing clothing, my shoulder was bare and there was a wound there, a burn, for example. So my nerve endings were close to the surface. And if I tapped myself with the same force, just as much, I'd have excruciating pain, even though the external event was not any different, but the sensitivity made me hurt so much more. And the more it hurts, the more I have to defend myself against the pain. For example, the more I have to push down my emotions, the more I have to tune out, dissociate, and so on. So what I'm saying is that these things begin as adaptations, then they get ingrained in the nervous system, and then later on you're diagnosed with this pathology. But what if we recognize, for example, that a child who's self-cutting, or a child who's got ADHD, or has been diagnosed with it, they're manifesting something in the environment, and that if our focus wasn't simply on getting rid of the symptom, or mitigating, or alleviating, diminishing the symptom, but we had a developmental perspective. If we asked ourselves, not just how do we deal with the symptom, but how do we help this child develop in a healthy way, that's a totally different question. And it's the same question you would ask yourself if you're, by the way, this is true for your adult clients as well. Because the good thing about the brain, there's this capacity of it that you may be aware of, which is called neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits even later on in life. And this has been demonstrated in, again, in either mice or rats. There was a particular psychologist called Marion Diamond who took these rats or mice, some young, some newborn, some middle-aged, and some elderly mice. And some newborn mice that they even deliberately brain damaged. They damaged their brains. And then for 2 months, they exposed them to a richer environment as compared to other ones that they didn't. More friends to play with, better food, more space, and so on. And after 2 months, the rats that had the mice who had the enriched environment were better able to find their way out of a maze. They were smarter. And when you autopsied their brains, in the front part of their brain, they had larger nerve cells with more connection to other nerve cells and richer blood supply. So that the physiology of the brain was affected by the social environment. Monkeys that are isolated will lose receptors for the chemical dopamine. Dopamine is essential for motivation. It's what we give to people with ADHD, is dopamine-enhancing medications. But the number of their dopamine receptors diminished as a result of isolation. In the United States, they have thousands of people in isolation in jails. It's incredible. Canada, too. I don't know about here. That affects the brain. And those same monkeys are put back into the environment, their receptors come back. In other words, if we asked ourselves, like a gardener would, if a plant isn't going well in my backyard, what conditions does it require? Nutrition, sunlight, irrigation. If in the same way we asked ourselves, what conditions does this child need in the family? How can we get the family to de-stress? How can we get the parents to understand the child's inner experience and to understand that the child's or the adult's behavior is simply a manifestation of inner processes? And if we can provide them with the kind of support they need, their brains can actually develop in healthy ways and their behavior will automatically change. In other words, what if we had a developmental rather than pathological perspective on all these conditions? And I'm going to finish by just, so much more I'd want to say to you, but I won't be able to. But I just finished with 2 items. One is trauma. So this word trauma, what does it actually mean then? Well, as you know, more than anybody else in the world, trauma comes from a Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is the wound. In this case, we're talking about psychological wounds. This is really important, what I want to say next. Trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. So, in my case, the trauma wasn't that when I was 11 months of age, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the streets of Budapest to save my life. That was the traumatic event. But the trauma was the wound. Because what does a child conclude when they're given to a stranger? That they're not lovable, that they're not worthy. And now they have to prove their lovability and their worthiness by going to medical school, you know. Or becoming a psychologist, by the way. It's just a general fact that if, as a child, you were not made to feel important just for your existing, then you'll try to prove your importance, and very often you do that becoming a helper. There's a lot of people in the helping professions, from psychology to therapy, to medicine, to nursing, that are trying to prove that they deserve to exist by helping as many people as possible, to the point of ignoring their own needs. So trauma then is what happens to you, inside you, not what to you, but what happens inside you. Now, I'm going to distinguish 2 kinds of traumas. One is what we call the big T traumas. These are the obviously difficult events, and these have been studied extensively. Physical, sexual, emotional abuse, a parent dying, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being addicted, a parent being jailed, violence in the family, neglect, a really bad divorce. These are the big T traumatic events. they're easy to identify, and they have documented, effects, so that, the more of them you have, the more likely to have addictions and mental health conditions and physical health conditions and so on. It's not even doubtful. Some people say, well, not everybody who's traumatized becomes mentally ill or becomes addicted, therefore this is nonsense. I mean, in fact, when I say some people say this, there was an article in the London Spectator 2 weeks ago that talked about the cult of trauma. Cult of trauma is sweeping the mental health world. Well, I say it's about time. But according to this addiction specialist, it's a terrible thing because, of course, not everybody, only a percentage of the people who are heavily traumatized become drug addicts or smokers. Brilliant. Brilliant logic. Think about it for 1 second. Here's the fact. Only about 15% of people who smoke cigarettes develop lung cancer. Therefore, cigarettes can't be implicated in lung cancer, right? It only happens to be a fact that 80 or 90% of the people who develop lung cancer are smokers. Which doesn't mean that everybody who smokes will get lung cancer, but just about everybody, not everybody, but just about everybody who develops lung cancer was a smoker. Incidentally, if a woman smokes, their risk of lung cancer is double that of a male. And that has to do with the stresses of women in this particular culture. You can ask me about it. I don't have time to tell you about them now. But the reason women have more mental health conditions and PTSD and autoimmune diseases is got to do with the social, cultural stress in a patriarchal culture and the burden that women carry in terms of absorbing the stresses of other people. So those are the big T traumas that I mentioned. But there's another set of traumas we can call small T traumas, and these are more subtle. Sometimes when I give these talks, somebody in the audience will put their hands up and say, hey doc, I've been addicted, but I had a totally happy childhood. And then I issue what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge, which is talk to me for 3 minutes, would you? And you'll find out that your happy childhood wasn't as happy as you thought. If anybody here wants to try it tonight, I'm very happy to bring you up on stage and prove to you just what a miserable childhood you actually had, okay? If you like, if you're really puzzled about that. Because there's another way that kids can be wounded. And don't forget, the wound is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you. There's another way that children can be wounded, which is not by doing bad things to them that shouldn't have been happening, but by not giving them what they need that they should have been given. You can wound children that way as well. So children have certain needs, unconditional loving acceptance, absolute security in a relationship that the parents are so solid that there's nothing the child can do to break or threaten that relationship. The freedom to be themselves, no matter how they show up, without that threatening the relationship. Their freedom not to have to work to please the parents in order to be loved and accepted. These are essential needs of children. Their freedom to experience all their emotions, including the anger and the joy and the loving and the curiosity and the fear and the grief. All these emotions that we're wired for in our brain, we have circuits for all of them. And we share those circuits with other mammals. And the child has to be able to experience all those emotions. Not that we should inflict on them some experience so they should have grief, but they're going to have grief because somebody won't want to play with them, because grandfather will die, because the dog will run away. They're going to have grief. And they have to be able to experience that grief, and they'll be able to have that grief validated and accepted and held by the adults. Children can be wounded, not because terrible things happen to them, but because the good things that should have happened did not happen. And that's the condition of a lot of children in a lot of societies, particularly in the so-called civilized countries. And the more stressed society becomes, like I mentioned, the economic crisis in Greece in 2013, the more stressed the parents are. It doesn't matter how, not that it doesn't matter, but it's not simply enough, that the parents love their kids. It's not the love that the parents feel for their children, it's what the kids receive. And the most stressed parents are, the less capable they are of being there for their kids in that mutual responsive sense that brain development requires. The more irritable they are, the less they can pay attention, the less responsive they can be, and the more the kids lose out. And that's another way to wound kids, is by just not having their needs met. So, I'm going to finish now with one exploration of what's required for healing in adults, and particularly what's required from us who are here to promote the mental health or to support the mental health and the mental transformation and growth and neuroplasticity and healing of our clients. And I'm going to talk about compassion, which is one of the very first balloon here, right at the end there. It says compassion on it. I've distinguished 5 levels of compassion that I'd like to leave you with. One is what we can call ordinary human compassion, which is where we just feel bad when somebody else is suffering. And most human beings are capable of that, unless something really bad happened to them so that it's completely choked off. I mean, young children start showing compassion at a very early age. Rats have compassion for each other. It's just part of mammalian life. So that's what I call ordinary compassion. It's necessary, not enough. The second level of compassion is what I call the compassion of understanding, which is not enough just to feel bad that somebody else is suffering. You also have to be curious about why they're suffering. So for example, for 12 years I worked with a heavy addicted population, people addicted to heroin and cocaine, crystal meth, alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, like everything you could imagine, fentanyl later on. Drugs of all kinds. And the medical mantra around addiction is that this is another inherited brain disease, genetic. You know, my father was an alcoholic, I'm an alcoholic, I inherited it. No, you didn't. What's it like to grow up in an alcoholic home? You didn't inherit the alcoholism, you inherited the trauma. Let me give you a definition of addiction and ask you a question. So an addiction is manifested in any behavior in which a person finds pleasure or relief and therefore craves, but then has difficulty giving up, suffers negative consequences, and doesn't give up despite those negative consequences. So pleasure, craving, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, difficulty or refusal to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Notice I said nothing about drugs. I said any behavior. Could be drugs, licit or illicit. Could be cigarettes, could be alcohol, could be eating, could be shopping, could be sex, could be pornography, could be the cell phone, could be internet gaming, gambling, work, any number of things. Let me ask you a question now. According to that definition, how many here would acknowledge that sometime in their life you've had some kind of an addictive process? Okay, just raise your hands. Okay, the vast majority of people. Now, usually ask people this question. If you want to understand addictions, here's the question you have to ask. Not what's wrong with it, but what's right about it. What did it do for you that you wanted? I'm not going to do that here, but usually the answers I get, it numbed me out, it numbed the pain. It released the stress. It made me feel sociable. It gave me pleasure. It gave me some escape. It gave me a sense of control. It gave me a sense of belonging. Now, if you look at all those qualities, pain relief, stress relief, more sense of control, sense of belonging, a sense of pleasure, are those good things or bad things? In themselves, they're not only are they good things, they're things that all human organisms essentially need. Essentially, so all the addict, or the so-called identified addict, is trying to do is to feel like a normal human being. And the real question, and this is my mantra on addiction, is not why the addiction, but why the pain that the addiction is trying to soothe. And if you want to understand why the pain, don't look at genes. Don't believe that it's a choice somebody's making. In the downtown east side of Vancouver, I worked for 12 years with this highly addicted population, a large percentage of them Indigenous. I did not have a single female patient in 12 years who had not been sexually abused as a child. And all the men down there had been either sexually or physically or otherwise severely traumatized. And nobody had ever asked them that question of what happened to you in your childhood. And that the problem is not your drug addiction. Your drug addiction is a problem, by definition. But it's not your primary problem. Your primary problem is that pain that you're feeling, that the drug is trying to soothe. That's why the question, not why the addiction, but why the pain. So that's what I call the compassionate understanding, where you really try and understand what happened to somebody. You don't judge them for their bad behavior. You try to understand what is the source of that behavior. The source? Trauma. Only 100% of the time. So that's the second level of compassion. The third one is what I call the compassion of recognition. Because all the while that I was working with these drug-addicted clients, I had my own addictive behaviors. I wasn't addicted to drugs, but I had behaviors around which I lied and I kept secrets, and which caused stress for my family and created difficulties in my marriage, and I didn't give it up. And so that I was much more fortunate than my clients. I mean, I had a respectable profession, good income, admiration from a lot of people, but fundamentally, that addiction process was in me. And my clients, when I talked to them about it, they never thought it strange. They said, "Hey doc, you're just like the rest of us, aren't you?" And you know what the truth is? We're all just like the rest of us. And the more you recognize that with your clients, that anybody you're dealing with, there's nothing in them that isn't in you. And whenever you think that it is, and you're judging them for it, it's because there's a part of you that you haven't looked at yet. So I think when we're working with clients, it's really great when we have judgments. It's really great when we get upset, because here's an opportunity to look at ourselves. So that's the third level, the level of recognition. The fourth level is what I call the level of truth, or the compassion of truth, which is we're not here to save people from pain. We're here to help people recognize the truth about themselves. And the truth is very compassionate, even if it brings up pain. We don't go out of our way to cause people pain, and we don't inflict on them pain in order to teach them something. But if they do their work, and if we do their work with them, the pain that they've been running away from all their life with their depression and their tuning out and their addictions, or their relationship stuff, it's going to come up. We must not be afraid of people's pain. We must support that pain, because basically, when you look at trauma, and again, I could talk to you a lot more about that, but the most essential trauma is that we get disconnected from ourselves. Why do we get disconnected from ourselves? Because it's too painful to be ourselves when we're small and helpless and hurting. So we get disconnected from our bodies, we get disconnected from our emotions. When we reconnect, that pain's going to come up. And that's what I call the compassion of truth. And Jesus, who was not only a great spiritual teacher, but also, like all the great spiritual teachers, was a great psychologist. He said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will liberate you." And that's the compassionate truth. And finally, what I see as I call the fifth level is I call the compassion of possibility. which is that when you look at a drug addict, an alcoholic, look at a person with ADHD or depression, or psychosis, or any physical illness for that matter. You don't mistake people for their behavior. You don't mistake them for their symptoms. You don't mistake them for their diagnosis. Oh yeah, I was going to say something about diagnosis. I said it doesn't explain anything, so take depression. So-and-so has depression. How do we know? Because they have a low mood, flat affect, and they socially isolate. Why do they have a low mood? Why do they have a flat affect? Why do they socially isolate? Because they have depression. How do we know they have depression? Because they have a low mood, and they socially isolate, and they have a flat affect. Why do they have, these diagnoses don't explain a thing. They describe things. It's useful and helpful to describe things. It helps us work with people, but never mistake it for an explanation. For the explanation, you have to look at the process they've been engaged with all their lives. The compassion of possibility, the fifth level of compassion, is the most difficult one of all, which is to look at another human being and not mistake them for their demeanor, their behavior, their symptoms, their dysfunctions. See the whole human being. We know what healing actually means. It means wholeness. That's the literal meaning. And so see them for the whole being that they already are, but they don't know it, that they got disconnected from. Now, if you want to see the wholeness, and by the way, Vivi and I and Ray and I just participated in this 4-day retreat at Zen Rocks, 3 hours from here. And you could see that people were like this, and the faces were scrunched up, and just not particularly attractive sometimes. At the end of it, you've seen this if you've been to a retreat. People all of a sudden, their physiology changes, their body position changes, the lines in their face smooth out, they become very beautiful. Ideally, we see that beauty and that wholeness is inside everybody. And here's the problem, for me and all of you, is that in order to see that in others consistently, we have to see it in ourselves. And that takes a lot of work. So the biggest work you're ever going to do as a psychologist, if you're going to work to help heal human beings, is the work that you're going to do on yourself, so that you can be a clear mirror for other people to see themselves. Well, thank you.
Aegean College. Πανεπιστημιακές σπουδές με το κύρος του University of Essex. Απελευθέρωσε τη δύναμη που κρύβεις μέσα σου.